All right, good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the Vice President of Sales at Radiant. My name is Dieter Schuler, and I'm going to lead a discussion focused around access to anywhere from anywhere. When I was in college, which was quite a few years ago, I had some friends that played this game where they watched Bob Newhart, and every time somebody said Bob, they had to take a drink. So I've been playing that game this week with the term cloud-first strategy and coffee, and I'm a little wired because I've heard that a lot. So we hear from some very large organizations that have said, I've got a CIO that's told me in 18 months we're going to do everything in the cloud, which is great. The question is, how does that change the game for you, and what do you have to think about in order to get there? For example, if you're going to move something to Azure AD, right? What does that mean in terms of being able to take the profiles that you have on premise and get them over there? If you're going to move applications to AWS, what does that mean in terms of creating a directory infrastructure in the AWS world? Is that going to be Active Directory? And if so, are your users going to still sign into the network? Is that going to be another directory? Lots of things to think about. And as you're all aware, the game has changed significantly. It used to be pretty simple because you had on-premise users or employees accessing on-premise applications using devices that were issued by the organization. Now you need to open up those resources to partners, contractors, vendors, customers, other third-party constituents. It's not just applications that are running on-prem, they're running in the cloud, in the hybrid cloud, they're delivered to you as a SaaS app. And it's not just devices that your organization is issuing, it's pretty much anything and everything, including BYOD. So what I'd like to do is introduce our panel and maybe have each panel member just kind of take 5 minutes and kind of explain at a high level where they are today, what they're doing to get to the cloud based on their company's initiatives, what challenges they're seeing, and how they're kind of approaching that. I'm going to start by introducing James Cups. James is from Liberty Mutual, and he is the enterprise architect for identity at Liberty.
Hello, Jim Cups, enterprise architect, like you just said. Our CIO has put out a very strong strategy to move as much of the load to the cloud as possible. Of course, that falls back onto everybody else that's in the organization to figure out how to do that. From an identity standpoint, there's a lot of advantages of moving out, but there's also a lot of risks. And one of the things that we've been trying to do is wrap our heads around the risks. We have about 57 country-specific directories, and right now we're using VDS to combine those into a single view. We're using ping, drawing from VDS and a couple of our other core directories to perform our authentication and authorization events out in the rest of the environment. And we're trying to set up a strategy on how to do that appropriately in the cloud. I think we have some good working examples. We have domains working in Asia Pac that are getting federation events from back in the US, and it's working just fine. But we definitely know that we need to get the directory stores closer to, especially if we're going to use like a WAM model for authentication and for the control of access, get the directory stores much closer to the applications themselves. So most of the things I'll talk about are, if we go through things, are use cases and problems that we're trying to solve, and maybe some questions to you guys on how you guys think we should solve it, because I find out that most of the best information comes from people that you talk to here.
Hi, I'm Paul Munsen. I manage the identity and access management platform at McDonald's. And McDonald's, we have a cloud strategy as well. We're looking to move a lot of stuff in both on the the infrastructure side using Azure, Active, and AWS. A lot of third-party niche applications. We've been fairly cloud-friendly in that sense for a long time, where we've used a lot of different software as a service vendors for various applications that are hosted externally. we're a big Office 365 shop. We've been leveraging that for a number of years. Some of the stuff with Azure AD is yet another step that we're working on the identity side, trying to figure out how that works. We have some of our third-party partners coming to us saying they want to federate at that Azure level. That's been a little bit new to us, so it's it's been an interesting area that we're exploring right now.
My name is Cory Plastek from Asurion. I'm a directory services and authentication architect. Mostly that means Active Directory, directory management tools, virtual directory, and then both our federation and WAM platforms. For us, our cloud strategy, I don't think we've met a cloud we didn't like. So we're very cloud friendly. We have line of business applications that are we're a heavy Microsoft shop, so we're going to take advantage of some applications that are only going to be offered in the Azure cloud, software as a service. There's a huge explosion in applications not necessarily being deployed in your internal on-premises network anymore, but adopting SaaS from everything across the board. We're using Workday as our HCM platform as an example. That previously we had something on premises that did that. And then we have a large shift towards enabling our developers to deploy in AWS. So, all over the world, all different types of application deployments happen there. The one common theme for me, and I think these gentlemen would all agree, is that every cloud platform or SaaS platform, the challenge is, I think of each of those applications as a directory in themselves, and they only want one source of information for all of it. I think it's going to be very difficult to say, well, I'd like you to take these 3 attributes from this thing you get, and then maybe on a separate job, maybe get those 4 or 5 attributes over here. That's not usually how it works. They're going to say, that doesn't make sense. Can I just point at one place? So we're going to use Radiant to provide that common source of identification, not only for our federation layer, but also for provisioning out where possible.
That's a really good point. When people first started looking at deploying SaaS applications, and they started to see the promise of federation, the idea was that I would be able to federate authentication back to an IDP, potentially on-prem, and life would be good. And I think what many people didn't realize at first and are starting to realize now is, even if you do that, the way that these applications are architected, they still require a profile that is relevant to them to be wherever it is that they're architected to point to. And so if you look at a SaaS application like Salesforce or Workday or ServiceNow, right, you can certainly get them to authenticate to your IDP. You might even be able to pass them a couple of attributes in your SAML assertion, like what group they're in, or what group the person is in. But in the end, right, they're going to make a call back to their profile database. And if the user stub is not in there, and if the right attributes aren't in there, they don't authorize effectively. If you take that concept and you apply it to a new application that you're now going to deploy on, let's take AWS as an example, versus spinning up servers in your data center, and you ask yourself, what is necessary in order for that application to function just from an authentication and authorization perspective? You start to realize that I either need a directory in AWS that is a mirror image of everything that I've got on-prem, or I need a way to start to federate back to my on-prem infrastructure and make sure that that's secure.
Yeah.
And so what I'd like to do is have Jim maybe start, or James start by maybe talking about a couple of the use cases that he's experienced,
Yeah.
And then we'll open it up to discussion.
Yeah, the nightmare scenario for me is we copy our directory into 10,000 different AWS accounts every single time we copy the entire directory, and then we lose total control of what our identities are. We can't keep them in sync. So you have to have a strategy on how to deal with that. And the strategy that we're going through right now is essentially federation first. So you have to use OAuth, SAML, OIDC to perform the application side events. You still have a struggle though with how do you control the resources. You know, in a purist world, you don't actually have access to the EC2 instances or whatever else that are in that environment. But the purist world doesn't always work. And you know, so right now the strategy that we're using is constrained views and allowing this constrained view to say, here's what, you know, here are the groups that these views are allowed to have access to and see. But ultimately, you're going to want to have the access to the information closer to the application. That means that you're going to have a cloud directory. I don't know exactly what the cloud directory is going to be. A lot of people are settling on Azure because they're already paying money for Azure for Office 365 and other things. But you know, if you're talking millions of accounts, then that strategy becomes pretty costly pretty quick. Even if you have that, you're going to have applications that are in other clouds. To your point, they haven't met a cloud they haven't liked. So you'll have IBM Cloud, or you'll have various different instances of AWS. You have to figure out whether you have a local cache of the user accounts and the attributes associated with those user accounts, or whether you can find a way to perform the federation not only for the application side, but for the infrastructure side. And then there's another layer, which is the control of the accounts themselves. So in AWS, you got your IAM settings. Those IAM settings are tied to the policy settings, which are tied to the roles in the accounts. Those are what decide who can build what in there. They're essentially the administrative accounts of those environments. Those have to be controlled as well. If you have multiple instances of AWS or multiple tenants in Azure, you have to have a strategy on how to deal with those. And the only way you can deal with those strategies is to automate the connections into your internal directories and to automate the way that you're standardize and automate the way you're handing that information out. Does that kind of?
Yeah, that's a good start. I'm just curious, how many of you are looking at putting an AD in AWS? Just kind of a show of hands, right? And why that? Why not a standard LDAP directory versus putting AD out there? Is it because all of your applications are doing IWA? And now are you starting to look at, well, wait a minute, my users aren't logging into the network anymore, or I don't want them to log into the network anymore? I'd love to get some feedback in terms of you know, what you're thinking there. Yeah. Do we need a mic?
So Matthew Nenning from ING Bank. We are, having a cloud strategy and also moving workloads to AWS and Azure. Why not doing things locally or on-prem? Well, sometimes the reason comes that it's more cost-effective to do things in the cloud. Recently I had a meeting with Suncorp. They are a little bit beyond us, and they mentioned, well, cost-effective should not be a good reason because cost will not differ too much. But as ING, we are active in 40 countries, and we have a lot of local data centers. And for us, doing things in the cloud makes sense because, well, we can scale things better, easier, and also have some sort of a single more platform instead of localized initiatives.
And so are you looking at an AD in the cloud, for example?
Yes, we're now in talks with Microsoft and AD in the cloud, but yeah, obviously not syncing everything.
Yeah. So our organization's in a similar position. One of the biggest cost savings that we have right now is we've got an off-site data center. So the goal is to hopefully eliminate that data center. That's a huge cost overhead on our organization. And the main reason that data center exists is for disaster recovery purposes. So migrating to the cloud hopefully mitigates that. So.
Okay. And Paul, maybe if you could talk a little bit about what the strategy for you is in terms of directory in the cloud. Obviously, if you're going to Office 365, you're almost guaranteed to use Azure AD. Right? What do you see there as the opportunities or limitations? Are you guys doing anything with AWS potentially?
Sure. Yeah, I think a lot of this is going to be a phased approach. I mean, there's going to be different levels to this, and it's going to take some time before we see what the end game is. For us, some of the, we have data centers that, with a traditional outsourcing provider, and we're looking to move to cloud cloud data centers. A lot of those workload migrations are taking traditional applications on traditional servers, or virtual servers, and moving them over into the cloud where it's still applications running on servers, right? We're not doing so much of the, platform as a service type stuff. I mean, there's places where we are, but, the bulk of the workload's kind of been this traditional move. So we have been putting Active Directory into these data centers, and it really looks like a traditional data center, just, we don't own it. I think over time, we're going to see a lot more moving towards using some of the AWS platform services or Azure services, and we're going to start realizing that, it's not just a new place to park servers, but it's a completely new architecture. So we're starting to do that. I have one of our internal apps. We're looking to have it in Microsoft and do it platform as a service rather than just plopping down a server and running the application there like we've always done in the past. So yeah, that's I think it's going to take a while to bring the organization along that journey. Everybody's not ready for it. We're going to have a hybrid for a while.
Yeah, so I agree. So I've heard a couple of people saying they're putting the AD out there. We've gone down this path, right? A couple of cautions around that. To your point, you can build, like you can pick Amazon region Northeast, and you can build your own VPC environment and get those pieces. And basically, you have three choices there. You use their AD connector, you use the Amazon AD environment, or you build your own environment. And you build your own environment on the EC2 instances, and you build an AMI to spin more up. But here's the catch: if you're doing that, you have the exact same problems that you have with the normal data center. Okay, there is no difference. You still have to worry about how you control the access. Yes, you have security groups to do it, but that's not significantly different than managing a firewall environment. You have to worry about the licensing on each of those nodes. You have to worry, all that stuff goes on. In addition to that, you don't get the ability to use that data center or those directories in other regions. You have to build other EC2 instances in those other regions. So if you're one of the global companies that are trying to do that, now you have the same exponential problem you're trying to deal with your global data centers. We've got 8 global data centers, 3 primary ones. You have those same scale problems in the cloud that you have internally. If you use a cloud directory like Azure, or if you use a cloud directory that handles that part of the problem for you, that gets out of it, but that doesn't give you a local directory to pull from. You still need to have a strategy to have that local directory to pull from. So backing up and getting into some of the details on this, one of the things you need to make sure you do is you're not creating your internal problems out in the cloud. And if all you're doing is building AD or LDAP instances out there on EC2 boxes, or whatever the variant of that is in whatever cloud provider you're going to, then that's exactly the scenario you're in. So again, strategy, federation first for the applications of some sort. If you can't do federation, if you have to have LDAP binds or if you have to have AD binds, then you need to have a synchronization mechanism that's automatable, where you can say these accounts get moved out to here, they're not connected to the internal accounts. You can provide the authentication events from back-end side, and the authorization events are local. So your auth in and auth Z are definitely different pieces, and you need to be able to manage those. And then the final piece about that is, how do you handle the automation on those, and how do you keep each of those flows separate from the others? So unfortunately, I know I'm just spitting out problems. These are not answers, right? But they're problems that if you haven't started strategizing around, then you're not going to be able to get to the good solution. The good news is there are good solutions, right? If you have VDS, then you can say, these are the views I'm going to use, this is how I'm going to automate the creation of a view, and then this is how I'm going to duplicate this information. I'm going to use Skim to duplicate it, or I'm going to have a Radiant Logic system out there that spins up and grabs it, or however you want to do it. If you're using a product like Ping, you can use Ping to do the federation for the exact same use cases, and you have the control over the access to the apps, plus you get the added bonus of having single sign-on across the environment and things like that.
Maybe just take a minute or two and explain the concept of a view, and then a couple of examples of how you guys are using that today.
Yeah, so a view is basically, and I heard you talking in more detail about it than I can, so I'll give it to you in a second. But basically, in my point of view, the view is You select which attributes, you select which accounts that you're going to grab. Is it a C and D and whatever that you're grabbing from the data from your directory store? You create that as an image, and you can control the access to that view. In our case, we're using certificate-based authentication back and forth, and I know Bill's going to stand up and throw something at me. Nope. Okay, I got it right. Good. So you use the certificate-based authentication on that to control the access to it, and you can see the specific. You're only seeing the specific attributes that you allow to be available on that. Now, you got to be wide enough that you don't have apps constantly coming. Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to hand it over to somebody I heard talk about this.
So it's a balancing act, right? You want to make sure that you are broad enough to cover 80% of your use cases with a minimal investment, because then you can just continue to build on your investment. You can set it up once, and then you allow additional applications to use that common view, and it's an immense ROI. But then for applications where, I need this specific attribute to look exactly like this or this or this, then you can create what I call application-specific views just for that individual application, maybe even for that specific application in a specific environment, that says, okay, just these attributes, or even just these users and just these groups. So now instead of going through and making sure that you have, your application is filtering all of the user accounts in all your directories and all your groups, you're just getting, the application is just seeing the users for that application and just the groups for that application. And really, when you're talking about groups in that way that's tied to an app, what's that? Usually that's a role, right? And that's really what the app guys want to get to.
Yeah, and by the way, to add to that, one of the things that I've seen consistently is applications that are architected to work only with groups as an authorization mechanism, where if you have the ability to create groups based on other attributes, you're basically creating what I would call a poor man's ABAC, because what you can do is put in place in the virtualization layer rules that will create and manage groups based on attribute values that you rely on. So the application doesn't have to change, right? It gets the list of groups that it needs, but those are derived based on the actual attributes.
So to that point, the strategy that we're driving towards is so we're integrating with the application pipelines. And so when Bamboo is doing a build, or when Jenkins is doing a build, or whatever, the goal is the application can say, these are the groups I need. So these are the attributes I need, right? The attribute-based access that we're driving. That the SSIDs are created and stored in a secure vault that is only accessible by that pipeline and that application within that pipeline. And that the different federation systems, so PingFed, the other federation systems that we have, are automatically configured to use those groups and pass those attributes on with the protocol that they're looking for in the app, right? So, you build a Spring app with OAuth, the OAuth configurations get built for your application at the same time that Bamboo's building out all the other stuff that it needs to build out for the app. We're only a tiny piece of that entire equation, but that app pipeline calls to a service that, frankly, our team has built that allows it to happen, although all of these solutions have APIs that you can take advantage of. You have to create the orchestration around these APIs, but all these solution sets have APIs that you can use to build those pieces. What that does is it gets you out of the unending backlog of, I need a new app in this thing. I need to have this in 3 days. Okay, fine, build it in Bamboo. If you build it in Bamboo with this template, it'll work, right? And a human being doesn't have to touch it.
Yeah. So final point for everyone. We talked a little bit about attributes. When you start to move some of these things out of your network into a cloud environment, you need to perhaps manage risk a little bit more effectively. So what can you do with the attributes that you have to start to think about risk-based authentication and maybe even authorization to some extent?
So the holy grail last year was to get the automation in place, and we were lucky, got the team, not lucky, had an awesome team that got the automation in place. The holy grail for next year, maybe the year after, is to get to real risk-based authentication. And the idea there is any identity that's coming in, you have a risk score associated with it. That risk score determines how transparent the authentication is for the user, and do you need to have a step up. As they're using you've heard continuous auth, it's continuous auth. As they're using the applications, you keep watch of the transaction sets. If they do something that's wildly out of the normal, so if you have a user that normally hits this application 500 times a day and all of a sudden they hit it 5,000 times a day, then you can either force, at a minimum, you can tell the SOC about it, and at a maximum, you can force a re-authentication of that user and maybe even a step-up authentication of the user. And finally, and this is the piece we haven't come even close to figuring out, is how do you integrate the context of the data in the back end? So this is the classic CASB scenario, where the CASB says these are the risky pieces of data that you have to deal with, and then you integrate that into the authentication path. The first two, I think, are always in place, whether you're using Radiant Logic or whether you're using Ping or you're using a combination. You know who's coming in and you have some context around that, and you know what transactions they're trying to perform. More importantly, you know what the statistic normal is for those environments. So.
Yeah, I mean, risk-based authentication and authorization is again, we're going to be looking at that, probably in next year as one of our big areas. And one of the big drivers for us for that is actually mobile applications. So it's not only, how do we make authentication stronger, but in cases where you may have less sensitive data, the traditional go into your web browser, log in, and have a session that lasts 30 minutes or 4 hours or whatever, gets really, really annoying on a mobile device. So how do you, set the right risk posture for either a company-owned mobile device or a personally owned mobile device to be able to, get that authentication frequency in a way that provides a good user experience where, maybe you're not doing bank transactions and you can afford to do that and focus on the experience.
I think if I took a step back, we do need to focus on risk-based authentication. I think that's kind of, you said, the holy grail of maintaining authorization or continuous authorization. But more importantly, that's just another attribute to manage for a user or identity or an account. So if we can solve the existing problems, we can hopefully apply the same patterns when we have the data, right? Or we can use that to feed the data into some profile, conceptually complete profile about a user or an account or an application, right? That's the only way that you kind of get to that whole picture.
I totally agree. The first step is figure out who your identities are, find the data stores that you want to have them in, and for the application, serve up the appropriate attribute sets for that application and whatever mechanism you need to do. The next step is get some control, whether it's through a WAM or through some other mechanisms, get some control over what the transaction sets are, and then the final piece is get the data. And you're right, it's attributes, right? It's the attributes that they have access to. So the first step is always going to be, how do you handle the directories that you have? How do you handle the identity stores? And how do you provide those out to the applications? So final question, just in the interest of time. So what I've heard here is one of the things you need to think about is how do you get the user data much closer to the application? Do you guys see that as a provisioning problem, or do you see that more as a directory replication or directory infrastructure problem?
I think it depends. I think you need to be flexible and have a few patterns that you use. I mean, certainly our default is always, when can we just provide SAML claims, and keep all that data in the directory and provide that. But there are applications that need to have lists of users. And in those cases, then it's a provisioning problem, and how can you minimize, and standardize on a certain number of ways to do that provisioning so you're not going crazy, but still provide flexibility to the application teams.
So I think you hit the nail on the head. When you need to do provisioning, then you need to make sure you're doing it all from the same place, right? So you're consistent, right? If you have to do it, you're being consistent, both in what you provision and when you provision, and then when you deprovision, right, or when you update attributes. I think that helps drive everything else.
We have a concept that I've been pushing that is starting to gain some traction. It's identity in a box, and the concept is that you use if you're going to have a directory set that is isolated from your core directory set, from your primary your authoritative source, if you will, then you have to have a reconciliation mechanism for that. you have to have a secure way of doing it, skims the obvious solution for that type of environment. And you have to have an agreed upon model on how you do it. So the idea is you spin up an environment that has an IDP-SP in it. The IDP-SP has to have a skim-capable environment. You have an identity store, whether that's a database or whether that's a directory, however you want to do it. When the environment gets spun up for that, let's say you're starting a new business unit up, or you purchase somebody, or if you're divesting or whatever, when that spins up, you agree that these are the attribute sets and the accounts associated with the attribute sets that get copied there, and then you have a reconciliation method that keeps your authoritative source accurate to a reasonable time period. And what I just described is kind of a bidirectional view model, if you kind of think about the basics of it.
Great. Okay, I think we're out of time. Are there any questions from the audience? If not, the panel will be here for a while, so please feel free to come up and talk to them individually. I appreciate you guys taking the time to come and sit here with me.